The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, where Dr. Sarah Chen had spent the last 18 months of her life. At 62 years old, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate danger as naturally as breathing. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours spent treating wounded soldiers and Afghan civilians alike. Sarah had come to Afghanistan not as a young idealist seeking adventure, but as a seasoned trauma surgeon who had lost her only son to an IED explosion 3 years earlier. Lieutenant Michael Chen, Marine Corps, had been 24 when his convoy hit that roadside bomb. Instead of retreating into grief, Sarah had channeled her pain into purpose, volunteering for the most dangerous medical missions in the world's most volatile regions. The forward operating base where she worked sat precariously close to Taliban territory. It was a place where the line between life and death was measured in minutes, not hours. Sarah had earned the nickname Doc Angel among the troops, not just for her medical skills, but for her uncanny ability to remain calm under fire and her refusal to leave wounded soldiers behind, regardless of the circumstances. On this particular morning, intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity in the surrounding valleys. The base commander, Colonel James Rodriguez, had already restricted all non-essential movement. But, for Sarah, there was no such thing as non-essential when lives hung in the balance. A message had come through the radio network about a small village 12 kilometers away where an explosion had injured several children and elderly civilians. The Navy SEAL team stationed at the base, led by Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, had been preparing for a routine patrol when they received orders to escort the medical team to the village. Thompson, a 20-year veteran with multiple deployments under his belt, had worked with Sarah on numerous occasions. He respected her medical expertise, but, more importantly, he had witnessed her courage under fire. "Doc, you sure about this one?" Thompson asked as he checked his gear in the armory. "Intel suggests this could be a trap. Taliban have been using medical emergencies to lure coalition forces into ambush sites." Sarah looked up from her medical bag, where she was methodically checking supplies of blood products, antibiotics, and surgical instruments. Her eyes, though kind, held a steel determination that Thompson had learned to recognize. "Marcus, I've been doing this long enough to know the risks. But, if we don't go, those children won't make it through the night. Sometimes you have to choose between safety and what's right." The SEAL team consisted of 8 men, each carrying enough firepower to level a small building. But they all knew that their most valuable asset on this mission was the slight woman in surgical scrubs who weighed less than half of what any of them did. Sarah had saved more lives in her time at the base than most soldiers could count, often working under conditions that would have sent lesser medical professionals running for cover. As the convoy prepared to depart, Sarah made her final preparations. She had developed a ritual before dangerous missions, writing a brief letter to her deceased son Michael. She would tell him about the people she was about to help, the soldiers she was working alongside, and her hope that her work somehow honored his memory. Today's letter was shorter than usual. "Michael, heading out to help some kids today. Good team with me. If something happens, know that every life I've saved out here has been for you. Love, Mom." The convoy consisted of 2 heavily armored vehicles, with Sarah riding in the second vehicle alongside Thompson and 3 other SEALs. The route to the village wound through rocky terrain that provided countless opportunities for ambush. Thompson maintained constant radio contact with base, while his men kept watch for any signs of enemy activity. 20 minutes into the journey, their worst fears were confirmed. The distinctive crack of AK-47 fire erupted from the ridgeline above them, followed immediately by the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades. The Taliban had indeed used the medical emergency as bait, positioning themselves perfectly to catch the convoy in a kill zone. "Contact left. Contact left." Thompson shouted into his radio as bullets began striking their vehicle. The driver, Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, immediately began evasive maneuvers while the gunner returned fire with the mounted 50 caliber machine gun. Sarah had been through enough of these encounters to know the drill. She immediately dropped to the floor of the vehicle, protecting her medical equipment while staying ready to treat casualties. But this attack was different. The enemy fire was more coordinated, more intense than anything she had experienced before. The lead vehicle took a direct hit from an RPG, killing the driver instantly and wounding 3 other soldiers. Over the radio, frantic voices called for immediate medical assistance. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her trauma bag and prepared to leave the relative safety of her vehicle.
"Doc, stay down," Thompson commanded. "We need to establish fire superiority before you can move." But Sarah was already moving toward the door.
"Those men are bleeding out right now.
Every second we wait, their chances get worse."
What followed was a firefight that would be analyzed and discussed in military circles for years to come. The Taliban had positioned themselves in a near-perfect ambush site, with interlocking fields of fire and multiple escape routes. They had also demonstrated tactical knowledge that suggested careful planning and possibly inside information about the convoy's route. Thompson and his team fought with the precision and ferocity that had made Navy SEALs legendary. But they were outnumbered at least 3-1, and the enemy held the high ground. Worse yet, they had wounded men who needed immediate medical attention, and Sarah Chen was determined to provide it, regardless of the danger to herself.
As bullets continued to fly overhead, Sarah crawled from her vehicle to the damaged lead vehicle, dragging her medical bag behind her.
Thompson provided covering fire while she worked, but he knew that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The enemy was attempting to maneuver around their flanks, and ammunition was running low. Inside the damaged vehicle, Sarah found chaos. The driver was beyond help, but 3 soldiers were still alive, though barely. Sergeant First Class Williams had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was losing blood rapidly. Corporal Martinez had a sucking chest wound that was making breathing nearly impossible. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, had suffered traumatic amputation of his left leg below the knee. Working under fire, Sarah began the delicate process of triage and treatment. She started with Johnson, applying a tourniquet to stop the arterial bleeding, then moved to Martinez, inserting a chest tube to relieve the pressure on his lung. Williams required immediate surgery to stop internal bleeding, but that would have to wait until they could reach a proper medical facility. "Thompson," she called out over the gunfire. "I need 20 minutes to stabilize these men before we can move them."
"Doc, we might not have 20 minutes, Thompson replied, reloading his rifle. "Enemy is trying to get behind us."
The battle continued to rage around them as Sarah worked with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the military medical community. She had learned to block out everything except the patient in front of her, whether the distractions were crying family members in a civilian hospital or enemy bullets in Afghanistan. But, as she worked, the situation continued to deteriorate. The enemy fire was becoming more accurate, and Thompson's team was slowly being forced back from their defensive positions. The radio crackled with reports from base indicating that reinforcements were en route, but they were still at least 30 minutes away. Thompson made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He moved from his covered position to get a better angle on the enemy fighters who were attempting to flank their position. As he raised his rifle to engage targets on the ridge, a sniper's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground.
Now Sarah faced an impossible choice.
Thompson was wounded and bleeding, adding another patient to her already overwhelming caseload. But, more critically, his injury had reduced their fighting strength at the worst possible moment. The remaining SEALs were now facing an enemy force that seemed to grow larger with each passing minute.
"Man down!"
"Man down," called out Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had taken command after Thompson's injury. Sarah looked up from her patients to see Thompson trying to prop himself against a rock, still attempting to return fire despite his wound. Blood was spreading across his uniform, and she could tell from his pale complexion that he was going into shock. The next few hours would test everything Sarah had learned in her decades of medical practice and her months in Afghanistan. She would be forced to make decisions that no doctor should ever have to make, under conditions that defied every principle of safe medical practice. And, through it all, the 8 Navy SEALs around her would witness displays of courage and skill that would change their understanding of what it meant to serve under fire. As the sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky, the battle for the convoy's survival was just beginning. The enemy had revealed their true strength, and it was becoming clear that this was no ordinary Taliban ambush.
Someone had planned this attack very carefully, and they had come prepared for a long fight. Sarah Chen, the grieving mother who had come to Afghanistan to honor her son's memory, was about to face the greatest test of her life. And, in the process, she would earn a respect from America's elite warriors that few civilians ever achieve. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain as Sarah Chen found herself treating 5 critically wounded soldiers while enemy fire continued to rain down around their position. What had begun as a routine medical evacuation had turned into a desperate fight for survival, with no immediate hope of rescue. Petty Officer Rodriguez had taken command after Thompson's injury, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban fighters had revealed themselves to be well-trained and heavily armed, suggesting this was no ordinary local militia. Intelligence reports later would confirm that this was a carefully planned operation involving foreign fighters with extensive military training. Sarah had managed to stabilize Johnson's leg wound and Martinez's punctured lung, but both men needed immediate surgical intervention that she couldn't provide in the field. Thompson's shoulder wound was more serious than he was admitting, with the bullet having nicked an artery. Williams remained the most critical case, with internal bleeding that was slowly killing him despite her best efforts. "Doc, we need to move these guys," Rodriguez called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Enemy is bringing up more men, and we're running low on ammunition." Sarah looked up from Williams, her surgical gloves covered in blood. "If we move Williams now, he'll die. I need another 10 minutes to get the bleeding under control." "We might not have 10 minutes, Rodriguez replied, scanning the ridgeline through his rifle scope. "I count at least 20 enemy fighters, and they're positioning for another assault." The radio crackled with updates from base. Air support was en route but still 15 minutes out. Ground reinforcements were facing their own ambush situation and couldn't reach the convoy for at least an hour. The small team was truly on their own. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. "I'm staying with Williams. Get the others back to the vehicles and prepare to move. If I can stop this bleeding, you can come back for us." Thompson, despite his own wound, struggled to sit up. "Doc, that's not happening. We don't leave people behind. Ever." "Marcus, be practical," Sarah said, not looking up from her work. 4 men with treatable wounds versus 1 with internal bleeding. Do the math. But Thompson and his team had been operating under a different kind of mathematics their entire careers. They had sworn an oath that no one gets left behind, and that oath included the civilian doctor who had saved more of their brothers than anyone could count. The next Taliban assault came with devastating intensity. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded all around their position, while automatic weapons fire forced everyone to seek whatever cover they could find. Sarah continued working on Williams, using her own body to shield him from flying debris. During the assault, Petty Officer Second Class Harrison took a bullet through his leg. Now Sarah had 6 patients, including herself. A piece of shrapnel had opened a gash across her left forearm, though she barely seemed to notice the blood soaking through her sleeve. "Rodriguez," Thompson called out. "We need to consolidate our position. Pull everyone back to the vehicles." But moving 6 wounded men across open ground under heavy fire was nearly impossible. Sarah realized they needed to buy time somehow, and she had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Does anyone have smoke grenades?" she asked. Rodriguez looked at her strangely. "Yeah, why?" "Pop smoke all around Williams' position. If they can't see clearly, they can't aim accurately. I'll stay in the smoke and finish working on him." It was a desperate plan that violated every rule of tactical medicine. Treating a patient in a smoke-filled environment made precise work nearly impossible. But Sarah had learned that sometimes impossible was the only option available. The SEALs deployed their smoke grenades, creating a thick gray cloud around the damaged vehicle where Williams lay dying. Sarah disappeared into the smoke with her medical bag, her movements guided by touch and 20 years of surgical experience. Working by feel in the choking smoke, Sarah located the source of Williams' internal bleeding. A piece of shrapnel had nicked his hepatic artery, causing blood to pool in his abdominal cavity. Without immediate surgical repair, he would be dead within minutes.
Using a technique she had learned during her residency but never performed in combat, Sarah made a small incision and inserted her hand directly into William's abdomen. Locating the damaged artery by touch, she applied direct pressure while using her other hand to guide a clamp into position. It was battlefield surgery at its most primitive and dangerous. Any mistake would kill Williams instantly. But Sarah's hands remained steady despite the chaos around her, guided by muscle memory and an unshakable determination to save every life she could. Outside the smoke cloud, the remaining SEALs maintained a defensive perimeter while dealing with their own wounds. Thompson had managed to bandage his shoulder, though blood continued to seep through the gauze. Rodriguez coordinated their defense while keeping one eye on the smoke cloud where Sarah was performing what he would later describe as a miracle. The smoke was beginning to clear when Sarah emerged, covered in blood and soot but with Williams stabilized. The emergency surgery had worked, buying them the time they needed to move him safely. "He's stable for transport," she announced, her voice hoarse from the smoke.
"But we need to move now."
As the team prepared to load their wounded into the vehicles, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. 2 Apache gunships appeared over the ridge, their chain guns immediately engaging the Taliban positions. The cavalry had finally arrived. But their relief was short-lived. As the wounded men were being loaded into the medical evacuation helicopter that landed 20 minutes later, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold.
Williams was showing signs of renewed internal bleeding.
Her field surgery was failing. "We need to get him to a surgical suite immediately," she told the flight medic. "The repair won't hold much longer." The flight to the base hospital took 12 minutes, during which Sarah worked frantically to keep Williams alive. She had managed to give him a fighting chance, but she knew that chance was slipping away with each passing second. At the hospital, Sarah followed Williams into surgery, assisting the trauma team with the detailed knowledge of his injuries that only she possessed. For 3 hours, they fought to repair the damage that had been hastily addressed in the field. When Williams finally stabilized, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and her own untreated injuries. She woke up 6 hours later in a hospital bed with her arm properly bandaged and 4-line providing much-needed fluids. Thompson sat in a chair beside her bed, his own shoulder immobilized in a sling.
"How is everyone?" were Sarah's first words upon waking.
"Williams is going to make it," Thompson said. "Johnson and Martinez are stable.
Harrison's leg will be fine.
Everyone's alive because of you." Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of relief. But Thompson wasn't finished.
"Doc, what you did out there today.
I've been a SEAL for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Operating in smoke under enemy fire, using your bare hands to stop arterial bleeding, that wasn't just medical skill. That was courage at a level most people can't even imagine." Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. "I just did what needed to be done."
"Same as you and your men."
"No, it wasn't the same," Thompson said. "We signed up for this. We trained for years to fight under fire. You're a civilian doctor who chose to be here because you wanted to help. What you did today went so far beyond the call of duty that there isn't even a name for it." Over the next few days, word of Sarah's actions spread throughout the base and beyond. The story of the doctor who performed emergency surgery under enemy fire while protecting wounded SEALs became legendary within military medical circles. But, for Sarah, the real victory was simply that all her patients had survived. However, the attack had been more than just a failed ambush. Intelligence analysis revealed that it had been specifically planned to target medical personnel, part of a larger Taliban strategy to demoralize coalition forces by attacking their most vulnerable and valuable non-combat personnel. Sarah Chen had unknowingly become a high-value target, and that knowledge would shape everything that happened next. The enemy now knew who she was and what she was capable of. They also knew that she represented something they needed to destroy: hope, compassion, and the unbreakable spirit of those who choose to heal rather than harm. The violence she had faced that day was just the beginning. The Taliban had shown their hand, revealing a level of tactical sophistication that suggested they were planning something much larger. And Sarah Chen, the grieving mother who had come to Afghanistan to honor her son's memory, had placed herself directly in the crosshairs of an enemy that now considered her elimination a strategic priority. But she had also earned something that few civilians ever achieve: the absolute respect and loyalty of America's most elite warriors. When the final test came, she would not face it alone. 3 weeks after the ambush, Sarah Chen received news that changed everything. Her deployment was ending. After 18 months in Afghanistan, she was being rotated back to the United States. Her replacement, a younger trauma surgeon from Johns Hopkins, was already en route to take over her position.
Sarah's final day at the forward operating base began before dawn.
She had spent the previous week training her replacement and transferring care of her long-term patients. But saying goodbye to the soldiers who had become her family was proving more difficult than she had anticipated. Thompson, now recovered from his shoulder wound, found her in the medical tent as she was packing her personal equipment. His team was preparing for a major operation that would take them deep into Taliban territory, a mission so classified that even Sarah didn't know the details. "Doc, I wanted to thank you before we head out," Thompson said, his voice uncharacteristically formal. "What you've done here, what you did for Williams and all of us, we're never going to forget it."
Sarah looked up from her packing. "Marcus, you don't need to thank me.
You and your men risked your lives to get me to people who needed help.
We're even." Thompson shook his head. "No, we're not even. Not by a long shot. You chose to be here. You didn't have to come to Afghanistan, but you did. And you didn't just come as a doctor, you came as one of us. You've earned something that can't be taught or awarded. You've earned our respect." Before Sarah could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the base.
The distinctive wail of the attack warning system sent everyone scrambling for their assigned defensive positions.
But this wasn't a drill.
Intelligence reports were pouring in about a massive Taliban assault force moving toward the base. Satellite imagery showed more than 200 fighters, along with vehicles and heavy weapons, approaching from multiple directions. This wasn't a raid, it was an all-out attempt to overrun the entire forward operating base. Colonel Rodriguez's voice crackled over the base-wide communications system. "This is not a drill.
All personnel to defensive positions."
"This is not a drill."
Sarah's training kicked in automatically.
During an attack, medical personnel were supposed to secure themselves in the fortified medical bunker and prepare to treat casualties. But, as she gathered her emergency supplies, she realized something that made her stomach drop. The base had been evacuating non-essential personnel for the past week in preparation for a major operation. The medical staff had been reduced to just Sarah and 2 medics. If the attack succeeded in breaching the perimeter, they would be overwhelmed with casualties before reinforcements could arrive. Outside, the sound of incoming artillery began echoing across the compound. The Taliban had brought mortars and, possibly heavier weapons. This was the coordinated assault that intelligence had been warning about for months.
Thompson appeared in the medical tent, fully armed and ready for battle. "Doc, we need to get you to the bunker now. How many wounded do you expect?" Sarah asked, ignoring his order. "That's not your problem anymore. Your replacement will handle casualties. You're supposed to be on a transport out of here in 6 hours.
Sarah looked at him with the same expression he had learned to recognize and respect over the past 18 months.
"Marcus, how many wounded?"
Thompson sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing.
"Could be dozens.
Maybe more if they breached the perimeter." The first explosions began impacting the base perimeter as Sarah made her decision.
"Then, I'm staying. 2 medics can't handle dozens of casualties. Doc, this is going to be the biggest fight this base has ever seen. Intelligence suggests they're planning to hold the base and execute any Americans they capture. You need to get out of here."
"I need to do my job," Sarah replied simply.
What followed was the most intense battle in the forward operating base's history.
The Taliban assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, with coordinated mortar fire and ground assaults that tested every defensive system the base possessed. Thompson and his SEAL team were assigned to the most critical sector, where the enemy's main assault was focused. As they moved to their positions, Thompson realized that this might be the last time he saw Sarah Chen alive. The battle raged for 6 hours. Wave after wave of Taliban fighters crashed against the base's defenses, each assault bringing them closer to breaching the perimeter. The medical facility became a constant stream of wounded soldiers, each one requiring immediate attention to stay alive. Sarah worked with a focus and intensity that amazed even the veteran medics working alongside her. She moved from patient to patient with the efficiency of someone who had learned to save lives under the worst possible conditions. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, fractures, she treated them all while the sound of battle raged just outside the reinforced walls. But it was during the 4th hour of fighting that the worst moment came. A mortar round landed directly on the communications bunker, killing 3 soldiers instantly and wounding 5 others. Among the wounded was Private First Class Danny Morrison, barely 20 years old, who had suffered massive trauma to his chest and abdomen. Morrison was brought to the medical facility in critical condition, his injuries so severe that the medics initially thought he was beyond saving. But Sarah took one look at him and saw something that others missed, a young man who reminded her powerfully of her own son. "Get me 2 units of O-negative and prep for emergency surgery," she ordered. "Doc, his injuries are too extensive," one of the medics protested. "We should focus on the ones we can save." Sarah looked at Morrison's pale face and saw Michael Chen, her son, dying alone in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. "We're not giving up on anyone. Not today." What followed was the most complex surgery Sarah had ever attempted under combat conditions. Morrison's injuries included a punctured lung, lacerated liver, and damaged major blood vessels. Any one of these injuries could have been fatal, and he had all 3. Working under the constant thunder of artillery and small arms fire, Sarah began the delicate process of repairing Morrison's internal damage. She had no surgical team, no proper lighting, and no guarantee that the medical facility wouldn't take a direct hit at any moment. But she also had 20 years of surgical experience and an unshakable determination to save every life she could. Her hands moved with precision and speed that amazed the medics assisting her, each suture and clamp placed with the accuracy of a master craftsman. Outside, Thompson and his team were fighting the battle of their lives. The enemy had managed to breach the outer perimeter in 2 locations, and hand-to-hand combat was taking place less than 100 meters from the medical facility. As Sarah worked on Morrison, she could hear the distinctive sound of close-quarters battle getting closer. Grenades were exploding nearby, and the sharp crack of rifles indicated that the fighting had moved into the base itself. "Doc, we might need to evacuate the medical facility," one of the medics called out. "Not until I finish with Morrison," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. It was then that Thompson appeared in the medical facility, his uniform torn and bloody, his rifle empty. "Doc, we're falling back to the inner perimeter. You need to come with us now." Sarah looked up from Morrison's open chest cavity, her hands still inside his body. "I can't stop now. If I move my hands, he dies." Thompson realized that Sarah was literally holding Morrison's life in her hands. The surgery had reached a critical point where even the slightest movement could cause catastrophic bleeding. "How long do you need?" Thompson asked. 20 minutes, Sarah replied. Thompson looked around the medical facility, calculating odds and distances. The enemy was getting closer, and the inner perimeter might not hold for 20 minutes. But he had never abandoned a teammate, and he wasn't about to start now. "Then, we hold here for 20 minutes, he decided. Thompson positioned his remaining team members around the medical facility, turning it into a fortress within a fortress. They had limited ammunition and no reinforcements, but they had something more important, an unshakable commitment to protecting the woman who had saved so many of their brothers. For the next 20 minutes, Thompson and 3 Navy SEALs held off an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were protecting something precious and irreplaceable. Inside, Sarah continued her delicate work on Morrison, her concentration absolute despite the chaos around her. When a stray bullet shattered a window near her surgical station, she didn't even flinch. When a grenade exploded close enough to shake the building, she simply adjusted her stance and continued working.
Finally, after what seemed like hours, Sarah stepped back from the surgical table.
Morrison's vital signs were stabilizing, and the bleeding had stopped. He would live. He's stable, she announced to the medical team. He'll need more surgery once we get him to a proper facility, but he's out of immediate danger. It was then that she noticed the silence. The shooting had stopped. Looking around, she realized that Thompson and his team had successfully defended the medical facility until reinforcements could arrive and repel the main assault. Thompson appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of men who had been pushed beyond their limits. Behind him stood the other members of his team, all wounded but all alive.
"Doc," Thompson said quietly, "it's over. The attack has been repelled."
Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she was.
"Morrison?"
"We'll make a full recovery, thanks to you," one of the medics reported. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah realized that her time in Afghanistan was truly ending. Her replacement had arrived during the battle and was already taking over care of the less critical patients. Within hours, she would be on a transport back to the United States. But first, something unprecedented was about to happen. Word had spread throughout the base about what Sarah had done during the attack. She had risked her own life to save Private Morrison while the base was under the most intensive enemy assault in its history. More importantly, Thompson and his team had risked their lives to protect her while she worked. Colonel Rodriguez gathered the entire base personnel in the main courtyard as the sun was setting on Sarah's final day. What happened next had never occurred in the history of the forward operating base. As Sarah walked across the courtyard toward the transport vehicle that would take her to the airport, every soldier on the base came to attention. Then, in a gesture of respect usually reserved for fallen heroes, they began to salute. First Thompson and his SEALs, then the other special operations units, then the regular Army and Marine units, then the support personnel. One by one, every person on the base rendered the formal military salute to the civilian doctor who had embodied everything they fought for. Sarah stopped walking, overwhelmed by the unprecedented display of respect. In 20 years of military medicine, she had never seen anything like it. Civilians didn't receive military salutes. But Sarah Chen was no ordinary civilian. Thompson stepped forward and spoke for everyone present. "Ma'am, you came here to honor your son's memory. But you've honored all of us. You've shown us what courage really looks like. You've reminded us why we serve." As Sarah boarded the transport that would take her home, she carried with her something that couldn't be measured or quantified: the respect of America's finest warriors and the knowledge that she had made a difference in a place where difference meant everything. Morrison made a full recovery and returned to duty 6 months later. Williams went back to his family in Texas and named his newborn daughter Sarah. Thompson and his team completed their deployment and returned home safely. But the story of the doctor who performed surgery under fire while Navy SEALs protected her became legend. It was told in military hospitals and training facilities around the world as an example of what it means to serve with honor under impossible circumstances. Sarah Chen had come to Afghanistan as a grieving mother seeking to honor her son's memory. She left us something much more, a symbol of the courage and compassion that makes some people willing to risk everything to save others. And, in earning the ultimate respect of America's most elite warriors, she had found a way to transform her grief into something that would inspire others for generations to come.